Thanks very much, everyone, for coming today. My name is Lisa McFetridge, so I'm a senior lecturer in statistics within the Mathematical Science Research Centre here at Queen's. And today I want to talk to you about just kind of some initial analysis that I'm looking at to analyse intensive care unit patient data. So in particular for this analysis, we're focusing on robust mixed effects models. So I'll kind of talk to you about just some of the initial work that I'm doing in that regards. Okay, so throughout the talk then, what we're going to focus on is initially looking at the aims of the project. So the challenges that they're looking at in the intensive care unit and the data that we're analysing, then introducing some different types of robust mixed effects models that I'm initially using in this analysis. So focusing mainly initially on modelling the location, and then we're going to move on to also modelling then the variance as well, and using kind of more robust approaches within that as well. Okay, so this work is undertaken in collaboration with my two collaborators. So Dr. Charles Gillen is a senior lecturer in computer science within Queen's, and Dr. Morelli Shazander is a consultant in respiratory. He's an intensive care physician, mainly based in the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast. Now, this work is very much in the initial stages, so it's giving you just kind of a flavour of what we're starting to look at within this analysis. And it's feeding into an ICMS Knowledge Exchange Catalyst Fellowship that I'm going to start in September then. That's going to follow on. Now, the ultimate aim of this project is to develop a personalised alert system in the intensive care units across Northern Ireland. So in particular, what we're trying to focus on is looking at early intervention of what's known as a ventilator-associated event. So a ventilator-associated event is such as a ventilator-associated pneumonia. So patients that are critically ill are put onto ventilators, which is obviously a life-saving therapy. It is obviously a positive thing for those patients to help their prognosis, but it also comes with risks. And the problem is that those patients tend to develop then what's known as VAEs, so ventilator-associated events, in particular pneumonia. If patients that are already critically ill then develop pneumonia, it essentially means that they tend to stay on ventilators for a lot longer, which then leads to poorer prognosis for those patients. If we think from kind of removing the patient type analysis and just looking at a critical care resource, then as well having patients staying in the ICU departments longer, there is only a limited number of beds, so it's obviously having that impact from a kind of overall perspective as well, taking the patient out of that. Focusing on the patient, however, it does mean though that if they have ventilator-associated events, then they have higher mortality rates. So they've 10% attributed mortality whenever they have these kind of events such as pneumonia. So what we're trying to do is essentially use some of the statistical techniques that I use in my research within this context to try to be able to set up this system where we can try to have early intervention to try to identify patients that are likely or are on the start of having these negative events, to try to then have early intervention and to also monitor these patients over time so that hopefully then we can help inform clinicians, the doctors in the ICU, the nurses, to then change the treatment plans of these patients for the better. So that's the kind of ultimate overall arching aim of the work. Now to do this, what we're going to use is this new database that is currently being housed in the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. So it's in the basement, as far as I know, of the City Hospital. And essentially, it's data that's being gathered from patients as they enter the ICU departments or high dependency units in Northern Ireland. So what we can do is, or what we're gathering, is this information from pretty much everything across the journey of the patient as they enter the ICU. So we're knowing whenever they're admitted, their transfers across different beds, whenever they're discharged, and during that time period, we're gathering information about their labs, the different drugs or doses that the nurses are administering to the patients, And as well as that, information from medical devices, so the likes of the information that's taken from the ventilators or the ECGs. So these are taken every minute for these patients, so it's very intensive longitudinal data whenever we're looking at that medical device data. So there's a lot of information that's being gathered, and this is a system that my collaborators set up in April 2020. They got it running, and it's really an untapped resource at the moment. So not a lot of in-depth analysis has been looked at within this. This is the first kind of set of statistical models that we're looking at within that kind of that database. Okay, so it is very much initial work, and it's very complex data sets that we're looking at. Now, what I'm going to focus on in this talk is just kind of initial analysis, just kind of that I'm doing to get an idea of what's in the data and what we can do with the data set, and how that then relates back to the research that I look at. So we're going to focus initially on the lab data that we're gathering within this database for individuals who have been going into the ICU departments or HDU departments in 3 locations in Northern Ireland. So that's the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast City Hospital, and then the Mater Hospital as well. And the data that I'm looking at is only a snapshot of the data. It's essentially just to give me an idea of what is being gathered. And that's looking at data collected from April 2020 through to September 2021. But this is data that's constantly being gathered, so there is a new source of data then, much more data that we can extract from the database then to continually improve and update the models. So for the sample of data that I'm looking at, we're looking at about 1,700 patients, total of about 60,000 observations, and typically these patients stay about 3.8 days in hospital. That's our median. Some patients are staying less than a day, some patients are staying 147 days. So there's a good range of patients that are staying long. Now, what we're going to focus on in particular is one of the key biomarkers for individuals is their albumin levels. So albumin levels play a key role whenever we're monitoring critically ill patients. Essentially, if patients get critically ill, their albumin levels tend to drop dramatically. And what we can see is that they're increasing as they get into more of a recovery phase, so their prognosis is improving. And as well then, if patients have low values of albumin, that's tend to be associated with higher mortality rates. So we're going to look at this here as kind of an initial biomarker to see what may be of interest within this data set. But there is a wide range of different biomarkers that we can look at. This is definitely just initial work. Now within this, the profile plots at the bottom just shows a selection of randomly chosen individuals, just to give you an idea of what the albumin levels look like as the patients are staying during their hospital stay. Now within this, what we're doing is gathering multiple observations per patient over time. So we're looking at longitudinal data. So longitudinal data is essentially where we have a collection of observations clustered within individuals. And what we tend to do then, or a lot of the times, is use mixed effects models to analyse this. Just in case you're not familiar with mixed effects model, I'll just introduce it, but it may be familiar to some of you. So within the mixed effects model, we have our response variable, or Yij. That's the thing that we're trying to model. And we're going to assume that there is a true underlying response, Y star, plus an random error term, that's our epsilon ij. And based on the true underlying response, we're going to separate that out so that we're going to have fixed population level effects as well as individual specific random effects. Now, if we think about this in terms of the fixed effects, that's quite similar to the coefficients that we get out from our standard linear models. But within repeated measurements, longitudinal data, we naturally have clustering where the observations within one patient is more clustered or more related to their own measurements than to other patients. So what we do is we tend to include individual random effects as well to take into account that clustering within the dataset. So that's our BI parameters. Now, within standard mixed effects models, what we tend to do then is to assume that these two random terms are random effects, or BI, and are random error terms, or epsilon I, that they follow normally distributed random effects or random terms. So our BIs follow normality, mean of 0 and covariance of D. Our random error terms, or epsilon ij, follows normality with a mean of 0 and a variance of sigma squared E. So this is our standard mixed modelling approach. Now within the, for the ICU data set, what we can do is kind of build these models up. So we're going to look initially at just a random intercept only model, add in a random slope, and then add in our covariates. And we're just essentially testing whether we need these random effects within the model to account for the cluster. So doing this for the ICU data set, looking at the albumin, once we include our random intercept term, we see that 72% of the total variation is accounted for just by including that random intercept term. So essentially we're saying that each individual's initial values are different across the population, which is what we would expect. We can then add in a random slope to that model, so comparing the two models, one with just a random intercept only and one with a random intercept and slope, then we see that there's significant improvement whenever we add in the slope, and essentially that's then saying that we are finding different trends of individuals' trends over time compared to the population, which again is what we would expect. The rate of change for different individuals would naturally change differently across the population. So it's something that we typically find whenever we're looking at longitudinal data, but it's always good to check just to make sure. As well as that then, we're going to add in a couple of covariates. So we're only looking at kind of simple models at the moment, just kind of testing what's within the data set. So we're just going to add in a couple of covariates. So initially looking at HCT, which is our hemocrit levels, the percentage of red blood cells, our MCHC, which is our concentration of hemoglobin, and our PLT, which is our platelet counts, and see how these impact then the albumin levels for patients. In doing that, initially we're going to just run the model quickly through an LME package in R, so just using frequentist approaches, and we can see then that each of the covariates have a significant impact on the albumin levels of patients. In particular, if we're focusing on the different biomarkers, if we look at HCT, MCHC and PLT, then we're seeing that these here have a positive impact on a patient's albumin levels. So as one increases, the other increases. And remember, albumin levels, if they get higher, then that there's better prognosis for patients, better low levels tend to be associated with mortality. So this has given us kind of some information which clinicians could potentially use, that if they're trying to improve a patient's albumin levels, then they can focus on the likes of these biomarkers and see. So it's just giving us kind of an initial look at what impacts our albumin levels. But within these models, as I said, then we have these normality assumptions for our random terms. Now, whenever we look at those normality assumptions, so we can do that within the random errors, so that's our epsilon i's, and our random effects, our BI's. Then we can see that from this plot, or QQ plot, and then doing normality tests, that our random errors don't follow normality, there is departure. So it's suggesting that there is outliers within the data. Okay? As well then, we can get a similar story whenever we look at our random effects. So looking at multivariate normality tests, we can see that there is again departure from normality whenever we look at these random error terms. So the assumptions that we're making in the standard mix models are being violated. So there is outliers within the data. Now, essentially, whenever there's that, we need to take those outliers into account. So that's where the robust mixed modelling approaches comes in. Now, within longitudinal data, there's these two types of outliers that can be present. We can have either B outliers, so that there is outlying individuals. So if we think about these kind of longitudinal profiles over time, then B outlier is an individual whose average trends differ significantly, outlie from the rest of the population, so the likes of that red line. In the ICU analysis, this here individual would be maybe an example of a B outlier. So the blue line gives the individual observed responses over time. The red line gives the population average, and we can see there's a good difference. This individual in particular has a really low levels of albumin compared to what we would typically see in the population. So that's probably indicating that that person's a B outlier. Okay. We can also then have what's known as E outliers. So E outliers are outlying observations. So if we focus down on one particular individual and look at their average trends of that individual over time, then if they have observations that outlie from their individual specific trends, then that's known as E outliers. So an example of that for within the ICU data set might be the likes of this person. So this level, this observation is significantly different than what we would expect based on the rest of their average trend over time. So that might be an example of an E outlier. So as I said, we need to take those into account. Okay, so if we have longitudinal outliers within the data, if we don't take into account those outliers and just keep with our normality assumptions, then we've shown in the past that we can get a lot of bias or inefficiency in the estimates. So we need to do something to make this model more robust with those outliers. Now, what we can do then is an approach that was first proposed by Pinheiro a long time ago now, and then has been adapted since, is that we can change the t-distributional assumptions to, the normal distributional assumptions to t-distributional assumptions instead. So essentially, if we think about it, normality is impacted quite a bit by outliers. What we can do is if we change it to the t-distribution, that has thicker, heavier tails, so it can account for those outliers a lot better. Now, what Pinheiro did in 2001 is introduced the robust mix model where it has common degrees of freedom. So we can change the B, the random effects, and the random errors, or epsilon ij, to instead follow t-distributions where we're going to assume that the degrees of freedom is the same between the two random terms. Now, that's the initial kind of approach, so I'm just kind of showing it as an illustration and then making things a bit more flexible then later on. So essentially that a common degrees of freedom assumption is quite restrictive, and we're going to see that then in a couple more slides. But it's what was initially done just to see whether this is an approach that we should be looking at. Now, within these models, what we're going to do is instead of using the t-distribution directly, we're going to use the gamma normal hierarchical form of the t-distribution. So we're going to change that t-distribution using the properties of the t-distribution and instead look at terms which follow a normal distribution and a gamma distribution and merge them together. So if we look at it for the random error terms, or epsilon ij, then we want it to assume that the t-distribution follows this 0 sigma squared e mu. We're going to then look at that in terms of the gamma normal hierarchical form. So our epsilon ij given tau I is going to follow a normal distribution, mean of 0, and a variance then divided by this tau I, where the tau I then follows the gamma distribution with nu over 2 parameters. Okay, well, nu is our degrees of freedom from the t. So doing this, it just makes, even though it looks more complicated, it makes the estimation a lot easier and a lot faster. So it's a lot better approach, and it's what we're going to just assume anytime that we're looking at t-distributions throughout the rest of this talk. We're going to assume that we're in the background doing this gamma normal hierarchical form of the model. Now, within this model, what we're going to do is estimate these degrees of freedom based on the data. So that just means then that depending on the data set, if there is outliers present, then the degrees of freedom, if it's less than 30, then it'll be able to capture that, the presence of outliers. If, however, there's no outliers present, then estimating the degrees of freedom, that should give us an estimate of above 30, where essentially our normal distribution and our t-distribution sit on top of each other. So it's getting us back to the standard normal that we just talked about. Okay, so and doing that, there's no loss essentially between the two because it's all just kind of estimating it from the data. Some of the earlier approaches just kind of guess the degrees of freedom, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would definitely estimate it. Okay. Now, in doing that, we can also look at it, so if our new degrees of freedom is greater than 30, then it reverts back to normality. That's also equivalent to having our tall parameters equal to 1, and again, that reverts us back to normality as well. Now, for this, what we're also going to do is use the non-centralized parameterization, and again, that there is just for improved efficiency. It makes the models just run a lot faster, okay? And that's again just using the properties of our distributions. So for this, once we're actually improving these models, once we're getting more complex, then the estimation also gets more complex. So what we're going to do is then move from a frequentist approach into a Bayesian framework instead. So we're going to use all these models then I've coded in R using RSSNI. So we're going to use this Bayesian framework instead, just because, not necessarily for this model, but for the ones that I'm going to present later on, they get a lot more complex, okay? So within this, we're looking at a no U-turn sampler, so NUTS variant of the Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. We're also trying to improve efficiency by using a thin QR decomposition on the design matrix X, and we're using a Koleski decomposition on our variance covariance matrix D. Okay, and all that there is essentially just to improve the efficiency and to hopefully help the MCMC, the Bayesian sampler, then to actually work more efficiently. Now, doing this then based on the ICU data set, then we get the following model. Remember, this is the model where we have shared degrees of freedom. So we're estimating that parameter, our new parameter, from the data, and we're assuming that the t distribution for the random effects, our BIs, and our random error terms, or Fs and IJs, both follow a t distribution with the same degrees of freedom, or nu. So that's why I've highlighted that, because that's the thing that we're going to really focus on. So our new degrees of freedom, remember, if it's low, then that's improving or increasing the tails of the distribution, meaning heavier tails. So what is it? It's suggesting that there is outliers present, and it is accommodating for those outliers. If it goes above 30, then we just revert back to normality. In this case then, based on this simpler model, what we're finding is the new degrees of freedom is approximately 4.9. So it is suggesting that there's outliers present, which again agrees with what we saw in the QQ plots anyway. So we are trying to take that into account, and what we can see is the credible intervals, they don't overlap 30, so it is definitely needed within this analysis. However, this model had a really big assumption. We assumed that the degrees of freedom parameters was the same between our random effects and our random error terms. So we're essentially saying that the degree of outlying for our E outliers and our B outliers is the exact same, which is a very restrictive assumption and something we want to alleviate. So we can do that then by separating out and decoupling the B's and BI and F's and I terms, and essentially do that by having different degrees of freedom for the two distributions. So we're going to change this then so that our BIs, our random effects, follow a t distribution with nu B degrees of freedom. Our errors, our F's and IJs, follow a t distribution with nu E degrees of freedom. And what we can do is, again, estimate both of those degrees of freedom based on the data. So we're just letting essentially the data dictate what type of model we're looking at. So what that means then is that we can have models where we are saying that there's E outliers present only, there's B outliers present only, there's E and B outliers present, or there's no outliers present. And we're getting that whole variety of models just within the one approach. Okay, so it's given it a lot more flexibility. Obviously, though, once we increase our flexibility, we increase the complexity of the model. So in the background, whenever we're looking at our log likelihood approaches, then we're increasing the log likelihood that we're looking at. So just to give kind of you an idea, the top two boxes then are what we would typically assume or typically have whenever we're looking at a standard mixed effects approach. Slightly different because there's no tau parameters, but that's the kind of level of our log likelihood for the first model that I presented, the standard mixed effects model. Whenever we add in the complexity of the last model with shared degrees of freedom, we're adding the next line in, that purple line. Slightly different, but you get kind of the point. And then whenever we're separating it out so that there are two separate degrees of freedom, we're adding in the last line. So we're adding in kind of a lot of complexity as we're going on, but it is worth it. It definitely is, because we're allowing that decoupling of our random effects and our random error terms, which is what we need, okay, to be able to properly take all this into account. That just gives you kind of an idea of what we're looking at and why we need to kind of move from this kind of frequentist approach into more a Bayesian approach to be able to handle that kind of complexity in the log likelihood. Now, whenever we do that for the ICU data set, what we're looking at then in particular is kind of focusing on these degrees of freedom parameters again. So remember, this is the thing that we're adding into this new model. And essentially, we're looking at nu E and nu B. So that's our degrees of freedom for our random error terms and our degrees of freedom then for our random effects, respectively. And essentially, again, if we get degrees of freedom that's above 30, then the t-distribution sits on top of the normal distribution, and again, we revert back to normality. What we can see within this then, for the album analysis, that both of the medians from the posterior of the two new parameters, they are different than 30, they're a lot less. So it's 3.94 and 9 respectively. So we are seeing the fact that there is this need to kind of separate out these degrees of freedom and to take that into account in terms of the fact that there's outliers present in the data. Now, if we focus on these degrees of freedom parameters, we can look at the posterior distribution. And again, that just verifies what we've just kind of discussed. The fact that our degrees of freedom is definitely different than 30, it's a lot less. So what that tells us then is because the degrees of freedom nu E, that there's for our residuals or random errors even, that there suggests then because it is less than 30 that there are E outliers present. So that's individuals who have a tendency to have outlying observations. And because the degrees of freedom then on the right-hand side, that nu B is less than 30, then there are B outliers present within the data set. And again, we need to take that into account. So there are individuals whose own average natural trend line tends to be significantly less or above the population average. What we can do within this is, because we are able to then separate out the degrees of freedom, we're getting out these two different tau I parameters, one for our random effects and one for our random error terms. We'll remember these tau I parameters, if they are equaling to 1, then that kind of reverts back to normality. What we can do is use those then to identify individuals that are kind of classified then as E outliers or B outliers. So looking at this kind of one individual, for example, whenever we're looking at their tau B parameter, it is equaling to 1.16. Their tau E then is equaling to 0.7. And what we can see then is, looking at the credible intervals, whether it overlaps with 1, and that will tell us whether they're a B outlier or E outlier. So within this individual, looking at their tau EI parameters, then they have a greater propensity essentially for outlying observations. That's what we're saying, because this credible interval doesn't contain 1, so it is different than the normality assumptions. However, whenever we look at their tau IB, then the credible interval contains 1, so it's not significantly different. So it's not suggesting that person is a B outlier. If we look at their actual trend lines then, given in the plot, so the blue line is what we're predicting from the model, the red dots are the observed values, and the black dashed line then is the population average. What we can see then is that the individual does seem to follow the kind of population trend, so they're not a B outlier. However, they do have some propensity for outlying observations. We can see kind of some of the points, the start then are kind of outlined from what we would expect those individuals to have. And again, that's kind of a common trait, that whenever individuals start kind of treatments or invasive medical interventions such as ventilation, then they do tend to have kind of more sporadic observations at the start, and we can kind of identify those through the likes of these models. What we can also do then is, because we can use these TI parameters to be able to say whether these individuals are B or E outliers, we can then use that information to give us more information essentially about these individuals. So looking at kind of what properties these people tend to have, in particular if we're looking maybe at their survival probabilities. So research that I've done, so I've done this in a few different data sets over my career so far, and essentially what I'm typically finding is that whenever there's outliers present, if the individuals are deemed an outlier, then they typically have a significantly worse survival rates than patients that we identify as just standard patients. That's in a few different kind of examples. In the ICU analysis example, if we look at their Kaplan-Meier curve, which is given here, so this is for E outliers, what we can see then is that there is a significant difference in the Kaplan-Meiers for individuals who are identified as E outliers and those that are identified as just standard patients, where the E outliers is given by the red curve and just kind of standard patient is given by the blue curve. What we're seeing then is that individuals who are E outliers tend to stay significantly longer in the ICU and hospital than just standard patients. So we're seeing that individuals with E outliers stay for a median of 11.9 days, and standard patients stay for a median of about 2.3 days. Now, the kind of caveat that I have to give to this is the fact that whenever the database was set up, they didn't record the destination of patients. So we know that this is their length of stay, but we don't know where they went to then. So we don't know whether patients are having other events, and that's why they are no longer there. In particular, death would be one of the key things whenever they're on mechanical ventilation, or whether patients are leaving the hospital because they're healthy, well, and they're out gallivanting in the world again. So we don't know at this point for this analysis, but we will know for the next extract because that's been added to the database. So all I can say now is that there is a significant difference in the length of stay of patients, rather than why, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, from kind of what I know in terms of the medical literature, what we tend to see is that patients with higher variability, so with kind of observations that do outlie a good bit, so E outliers, then they tend to have worse prognosis. So it could be a case that individuals with E outliers here are being identified as having longer stays in the ICU department because they are having worse survival rates. So therefore they're needing a longer time on mechanical ventilation than the average patient, which stays for about 2 to 3 days. But again, we don't know that until I rerun the analysis for the updated data set, unfortunately. But that's just kind of where I'm thinking at the moment. But it does show that there is a significant difference. So it does show that we need to identify those individuals and look in particular at their profiles to make sure that whatever intervention is needed is done for those patients. So everything I've talked about so far, we're kind of focusing on modelling the mean, so modelling the location. What I'm going to talk about then going forward is to then change that to modelling the variance. So we're going to revert back to the standard mixed effects model that we looked at at the start, so just ignoring for the moment E outliers and B outliers, and we're just going to focus on the variance that we're assuming within this model. So these equations then are just, again, the standard mixed effects model that we had from before. What we are focusing on in particular in this point is the variance within the random effects. So our epsilon ij follows the normal distribution with zero mean and variance at sigma squared e. Now what that means then is that every individual is assuming that their random error terms are all have the same variance across the population. Now that could be quite a restrictive assumption depending on what you're looking at. And what we can do then is to kind of just quickly investigate whether that is a bad assumption that we need to take into account. Now, looking at each of these individuals, just grabbing individual specific data and running just simple linear models across that, we can then extract out estimated variance terms for each individual and then plot it on the graph here. So it just gives us a kind of an initial idea about whether there's a difference in the variances across these individuals, okay, just based on simple linear models. And what we're seeing then is that there is quite a big difference across the different individuals. So we're seeing that individuals' album level, the variability in the album levels tends to be different from one patient to another patient. So what we want to do is kind of take that into account then. So what we can do, and again, we're still just sticking with the normality assumptions for the B and E outliers, for the random effects and the random error terms. What we can now do is update the variance for the random error terms, or epsilon ij's, and change that from sigma squared E, so a population constant, to an individual specific estimate for our variance. So what we're going to have now is the bottom equation, so we're going to model that variance as well. So our sigma squared EI then is going to equal our exponential of delta naught plus omega I. So these omega I terms then are individual specific random effects within our scale parameter, so our scale random effects. So what we're doing within this model then is incorporating both location random effects through our BIs, scale random effects then through our omega I's, and then modelling our residual variance through our normality as well. So we're trying to take into account the fact that these individuals have different variances. Now to do that then, we again I ran this, wrote codes in RSSNI for this. And what we're focusing on in particular in this model compared to the standard mixed effects model that I showed a wee while ago is this assumption of this variance, constant variance. So we can look at our sigma squared omega, which is our variance of our scale random effects. Okay, so we have our random effects across our scale, so each individual maybe has individual specific variance terms. And what we can see is that if there's no variability in that, so if our sigma squared omega equals 0, then we would revert back just to a constant, which is what we had from before. So because this sigma squared omega doesn't equal 0, it's significantly different from 0, there is some variability, which is what we saw in the last histogram plot. Okay? So we do need to take into account the fact that each individual should have their own individual specific scale parameters. Now what this means then is because we can then estimate these scale random effects, we can then identify individuals with a greater propensity of having maybe a larger than average variability in their biomarker. And what we've seen then in a lot of medical literature is that typically individuals with higher variability tend to have worse prognosis. So the ability to identify those types of individuals can be quite key to be able to try to intervene and stabilize their measurements a bit more. So for example, for this individual, their scale random effects then, or omega I, was estimated as 1.29, so that there's a good bit above the population average. They're having more variability than what we've seen typically in the population. And we can see that then based on this plot. So the blue line is their observed values, the population line is the red dash line. So this individual definitely has a lot more variability in their album levels compared to what we typically see across the population. So that's just being able to identify that. And again, it could be a case then that for this individual, intervention is needed to try to stabilize things a good bit more. So what we're going to do then is to try to model all that together essentially. So what we're going to do is go back to the fact that we have these E and B outliers. So look at T distributions for our random effects, or BIs, and our random error terms, or epsilon I's, but also now take into account the fact that we have scale random effects, so a need to account for individual specific variances. So that's this model. Okay, so again, we're going to assume an uncoupling of our B's and E's, our B's and epsilon, sorry. So we have separate new parameters for our random effects, our new B, and our random error terms, our new E. And now we also then have a normality assumption across our individual scale random effects. So again, we're kind of increasing complexity, but hopefully to try to model this a good bit better. Now, whenever we fit this model, what we can see then, these are just a plot then of the different estimates, and what we can see is, remember from the last plot, what we're doing is adding in the normality assumptions for the random effects and the random error terms. So we're focusing on the bottom two parameters, our new B and our new E. Now, whenever we look at our new B, if we have this estimated as less than 30, then that's outliers are present and we need the t-distribution. So it is less than 30, so it's suggesting that there's the outliers present, again agreeing with what we've seen before. If we look at the new E, however, our new E parameter is now above 30, and it's significantly above 30. So it's suggesting now that once we take into account the individual specific scale parameters, the robustness with our random error terms is no longer needed. So we just need to take into account the random scales instead, and suddenly the t-distribution isn't needed for that epsilon I. Now, if we focus on this parameter in particular, we can look at our posterior distribution, and what we can see then is that the new degrees of freedom equaling 30, there's an 85% chance that it's above 30. So there's no need to estimate this based on a t-distribution. Instead, we can just revert back to the normal distributional assumptions. Okay, so the only other thing then is our assumption regarding our scale random effects. Now, whenever we look at the QQ plot for our scale random effects, or omega I, then suddenly what we're seeing is that the kind of outlier status that we had within our E's, our error terms, is now transferred into the scale random effects. So our scale random effects suddenly are now departing from normality significantly. So what we need to do instead is assume a t-distribution for that. So this is the new model that we're going to look at. Now, within these models, what we can also do is, because we have outliers present within the scale random effects, we can use Mahalanob's distances to be able to identify which individuals in particular have these outlying values. Where again, typically what we find is that outlying values, so higher variability, for example, would be individuals that maybe are having a worse prognosis. So being able to identify those individuals are key. So we can use the likes of Mahalanob's distances to do that. And you probably can't see because of the light in the room, but the red dots then are the kind of ones that are going off into the distance. That's all of our outliers. Okay, so individuals that have variance terms that outlie from the population average. Again, if we identify these individuals as outliers and look at the Kaplan-Meier curves for the two classifications, the two groups of individuals, what we're seeing then is that individuals that are identified as omega outliers have a significantly less stay in hospital than those that are identified as standard patients. So again, because we don't know the destination, we don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. If patients are having a significantly less stay in hospital, that's probably, or could suggest that something's happening that is negative in the respect that the patients have died, but we don't know what at this stage. Again, it's things that it can rerun just on the new data whenever it's extracted from the database. But essentially what we're seeing is that omega outliers, or individuals who are identified that, have a median length of stay of 1.6 days. Standard patients have a median length of stay of 4.7 days. So there's something going on. And essentially that's the kind of moral of the story, that there is a need to be able to identify these individuals, because whether it's good or bad, we still need to be able to take that into account. If it's bad, then obviously for the prognosis of patients, we need to take that into account and be able to recommend to doctors to look at these patients more regularly, maybe adjust their treatment schedules or their observation schedules. If it's in a good way, then what's happening with those patients that's working so well that we can then adopt for the rest of the population. So we'll know once we kind of rerun the analysis on the updated data. Now, what we're going to do then is to essentially adjust the model to incorporate all of that. And that's where I'm up to at the moment. So this is the new model then that I'm proposing for the data, where essentially we're going to have t-distributed random effects. So to account for those omega outliers, the outliers and the variances. We're going to have still again the t distribution for the random error terms, so they account for the b outliers, but we're now going to revert back to normality for the residuals, the epsilon ij's. Again, just to reflect what we're seeing in the data. Unfortunately, though, that model is not working correctly yet. So, just to give a teaser, but it is something that I will definitely get running in the next few weeks. Sorry, just based on the light, I can't read that bottom bits, but I'll talk you through them anyway. So essentially, just to conclude then, this is definitely initial work, just to give kind of a feel of what's in the data set, to illustrate how we can use robust mixed effects models or robust location scale models to be able to help inform clinicians. And essentially the goal is to design this decision support tool that we can then implement in the ICU departments. As I said, then it's initial work for the fellowship that's going to start in September. And so far what we're seeing then is that there is a need to investigate the presence of outliers within both the random effects and the random error terms and the scale parameters, to look in at all of the different random terms that we can include within the models. Individuals who are identified as outliers do have significant differences in their lengths of stay, so trying to figure out, is that a good thing, a bad thing, but whatever it is, they do need to be accounted for. And as well then, to further investigate that relationship between, if we include individual specific scale effects, does that alleviate the need for more robustness in our epsilon ij's? So it's just kind of more exploring what's happening there. In terms of the further steps then, my key goal is to get that model working. Very frustrating, but it's essentially just not estimating correctly in the Bayesian. My sample size, my effective sample sizes isn't good at the moment, so there's something going wrong. But a few more weeks and that should be working. As well as that, there's loads of other things. So it's a really, really good resource of data. So my initial steps is to get that model working, then explore the intensive longitudinal data that's within the medical device data set, so that there's observations taken at every minute. So it's very intensive to try to see what these models are doing for that type of data. As well as that, once I get the kind of destination data, looking at the survival analysis, so robust joint modelling within this. So all the approaches that we've looked at so far can be used in the longitudinal component within a joint model, so adding in the survival component to see the relationship between those two, and as well as then looking at what aspects of these different models are key to be able to help clinicians in practice. So to work with Morelli, work with Charles to be able to create that decision support system, that alerts and personalised to help get these interventions in practice, essentially. So thanks very much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free, or advice, comments, complaints about Bayesian, anything. Thanks very much.
The first one's asking the hits why the last one's not really working so well, but I think you might have answered that.
Yeah, if I knew that, that's the key question.
Yeah.
I think I'm doing something wrong in just the way that I'm estimating the degrees of freedom for the scale parameters. There's just something going wrong, and it's going to be something silly. So I'm going to just kind of go with fresh eyes to it. It's nearly there. It's just not it's the joys of Bayesian. Once you do something slightly wrong, it always wrong. But it's great whenever it works. So at some point, very soon.
We've got another one on, and then Gilbert. Yeah. Someone's asking, do you need a training test data set framework to make it robust, given you're making it for predictions?
Yeah, so essentially we're just exploring at the moment. So I'm using the data that we have at the moment to try to investigate what's the need for the different complexity in the models. And then eventually I'm going to just look at patient data that is unseen and try to see how the model reacts. In particular, how many observations that I need for being able to get good predictions of the likes of the outliers for individuals, how far in advance I can make good predictions for patients, because the whole point is to try to get that early intervention. So how close can I get it to be able to have a good support tool, if that makes sense. But it's definitely a work in progress. But it's something that I'm working with my 2 collaborators on. So Charles is a computer scientist, so that he's going to be able to, once I get it working, be able to put it in practice. And then Morelli's going to tell us what we need to do, because he's the one keeping us right. Because it's great talking about all the statistical models. All he wants to know is, how is this working in practice? So that's the key thing. So yeah, I'll be using kind of train and test data sets then at that stage, just to make sure, because we're essentially wanting to build it and then run, but we need to make sure that it runs correctly, because this is critically ill patients,
Good.
Yeah, Lisa, you know what I'm going to ask you?
Yeah.
The idea of outliers really skates over the structure of the covariance matrix in these models. So it does. It's here you're very keen on identifying the characteristics of patients that don't agree with the model. The idea is one idea is that you can model the covariance structure simultaneously.
Yeah.
And that instead of thinking that, oh, this guy is outlying, and now we can go and find out why he's outlying, that if you've got the covariance in the covariance structure, you automatically take up the variation that is not T.
So that's the model that's not working, that's the next model. So the aim is to throw in covariance within the scale. So not just have a population average, but have an actual structure to see what covariance affected it, as well as the random scale random effects.
I think because it's longitudinal, that you can model the whole covariance structure. You've nearly done it.
Yeah.
You've got the Cholesky decomposition there, but not the modified one. You need the modified one, but that's okay. It's not far away.
You can keep me right with it, yeah. But yeah, that's the next step. So I'm trying to build it up to see, as we're adding in complexity, at what stage am I kind of covering everything, or how things are changing as I go. So the next, once I get the random terms fitted, then I want to compare that to just probably normality, assuming with the covariance structure within the covariance within it, to try to see whether or not that takes that into account, and you don't need the normality anymore. But yeah, that's the ultimate aim. Yeah, I'm just getting more and more complex since the joys of.
But the complexity typically reduces when you model the covariance structure. Yeah. Okay. Because the one of the ideas is that the specificity of the approach, because it's regression in the covariance structure, that varies in a way that's not necessarily described by any of our standard statistical distributions, but rather by whatever covariance structure you see in the data. And so this is why we call this kind of approach data-driven.
Definitely. I'll be in touch with you.
Just want to jump in. Is there a trade-off between efficiency and complexity here?
Yeah.
In terms
eventually there's going to be. So I want to see what need there is for the complexity, to see then whether or not they're to use it in practice. Ultimately you want to be this running as close to real time as you can, or anything like that.
Because I guess there's sudden changes can happen.
There's also another issue in that Rao has shown that the estimate of the fixed effects is covariance dependent. So that if you get the, if you think about it, it's in a weighted least squares formula. And what do you have in the weighted least squares formula? You have sigma to -1. So in that case, there's a premium on getting the covariance structure correct.
Correct. Because that might help
And
with the efficiency
now,
then.
you don't have that in survival analysis. So joint models in survival analysis are suck it and see operations.
Don't say that.
Well, that's what it is.
Yeah, well, it's that kind of combination of being able to account for the censoring process and the fact that individual measurements are censored based on what we're seeing in survival.
Yeah,
So it's that kind of
sure.
coupling approach, but yeah. Sorry, Lucy.
Sorry, I just had a couple of questions, comments. I don't want to take too much time, but
Where should I put my mic on? Just in terms of then the data that you're using, I guess you went through honest brokers for that then.
It's not me. This is all Charles and Morel.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
Because I'm coming in kind of late to the party. They set it all up. And
Okay, so the
essentially
next,
they
okay.
needed a statistician to be able to do stuff with
Yeah.
it.
Okay. So I assume someone's gone through honest brokers as an external project, not an internal, but anyway, regardless.
They're well used to all that sort of stuff.
Okay.
Because Morelli's also a joint lecturer.
Oh yeah, no, that's grand.
But I assume
So in terms of then, so maybe these would be questions for them. But in terms of so the ICU data would be more like you can have CPAP or also AirVo. So basically, there could be patients on the ward that actually have respiratory support. And so I was just thinking in terms of this data as well. There was an internal audit done in one of the trusts on ICU patients. Actually, it was done in September 21. I can't give you the info on that audit because it's all an internal project rather than like an external project. But it was essentially just a data audit. But it could be interesting if you link with, I can link you with the Department of Health for working on it, SIB and stuff as well during COVID. So essentially the data that you link to could very much link to, so the data that exists in the audit was basically those who've had their vaccines.
Okay, yeah.
And then also, I guess the BMI was a big predictor as well. So obviously with different diseases, the albumin level goes up and down as well. So if you're something for like liver issues, it could go up and down depending on what stage of your disease it is in. So I suppose my question was more, how does this differ from could you build a model, and maybe this is a suggestion or something, I don't really know, in terms of a causal inference component, because obviously you haven't got variables in there which are COVID. So you basically is those E outliers, are they essentially unknown causal factors potentially?
This is the thing, yeah.
Because you haven't.
So once you find the fact that there is higher propensity that an individual, but within the data set there's so much information. So I think there is information about different things within I think as well. You
might need to bring together some of the GP data and things because it was only internally seen. They don't know what vaccines, but it's just something because when you look at the different covariates, that actually a model would hopefully be able to incorporate some of that uncertainty, because you look at the two curves, but actually could that be someone with a BI above, I think it was greater than 35, was actually a bigger predictor of their ICU. So basically it was the ICU stays, but obviously that's an internal project with the trusts. It could be something I'm happy to chat about, or because they were really keen for something, but obviously it takes forever to get data and the right data, and as Olivia knows, any data that doesn't exist in the trusts, you have to go through a whole process. So it's not ideal. So obviously when you don't have the perfect data set, but actually I wonder if it is sort of those, when you draw your DAGs for causal components, because you're is the albumin causing these issues or the issues causing the albumin? So actually then these unknown factors could actually be brought in and actually be that what's it causing, because if you impact with the medication the albumin, is that going to make you better, or are you just putting a band-aid over the cut? Do you know what I mean? So there's probably loads you could do with this, isn't it? But it's really interesting.
Surface just to show you kind of initial type of stuff that we can look at.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. There's
every time you look at something, I think it's just more getting the time, to get it all through.
For sure, yeah. I mean, you could probably do about 10 PhDs in this, right?
Yeah, that's it.
There's a couple of questions in the chat.
I'll go for it.
Mark's got a follow-on one in terms of model misspecification, model diagnosis sticks.
Oh yeah, I
Complexity.
haven't. Yeah, apart from the QQs, I haven't looked into kind of. We're not at the kind of best fitting model that's going to be used stage. I'm still trying to just explore all the different data sets, but it's definitely something that I'm going to look into just to see. Did I write that question correctly? Yeah.
I think you have, yeah. And then Leah has asked about future plans for external validation of the tool.
Yeah, so
validated
it's
with
just
this.
essentially working with Morelli to see what they need and then being able to validate based on their needs essentially. So we don't know what validation's needed until we know what they want, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's just it's definitely just a work in progress because it's only this is the only first models that we've looked at based on the data, and it's just more working with the clinician to see what we can find, pretty much.
In general, these are true. When databases are first set up, they're very noisy.
Oh, it's awful.
Yeah.
I've never seen a database worse in my life.
Yeah.
Don't worry. No, that's one of the biggest things that I'm going to try to work with the computer scientist Charles to be able to
They need
edit.
restricted. But if you're putting in data willy-nilly as it occurs in real time, I mean, typically no one does that.
Yeah.
The farmers don't do that. Good medical researchers don't do that. They have CRFs, which are predefined research forms.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm used to it from
Yeah,
Four
sure.
Queens. Yeah.
So you'll find a lot of strange things in.
Yeah, I have. Don't worry. And I've only literally scratched the surface. The amount of data there is unreal. But yeah, the actual way that it's set up is just. It's not a statistician. A statistician would never set it up with that. Ever. It's quite funny.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with the application of this. Can you describe a new patient comes into ICU? What happens?
So we're trying to create this system where we can take maybe after a few measurements or after a period of time from the patient, feed that into
so that's
the
in the
model.
first 24 hours you've got measurements.
So try
Feed into
to
your model.
feed that into the model to try to predict whether that individual is just naturally outlying from the population. So that's just that they naturally have low levels
I
or
get that.
thing.
And that,
or-
but who's going to, as it were, do this? I mean,
Press the button.
who's going to press the button? Okay, I mean,
So to get it set up. So we
no, it's set up.
Yeah.
A new patient comes in,
Yeah.
you've got data from that patient.
uh-huh.
Right, what happens then?
So
You're not going to be there.
nope.
So
have the-
somebody in ICU.
Yeah.
So that's going to be part of their job.
Yeah.
Press the button.
Yeah.
And what sort of answer are they going to get?
Depends what answer they want.
No. No.
That's the basic.
I think it would depend as well because
It
obviously
depends what they need
Well,
from it.
who's going to press the button?
So presumably they're the nurses
It won't be the
ICU
consultant.
I don't know. I work with.
Well, okay, let's give it the benefit of the doubt. The consultant presses a button, and what's going to come out? If the person is not an outlier?
So you'd actually need to work, so there's a different project I'm working on within the trust. So basically, one of the things that could be an avenue to go down is that obviously for the indemnity of the consultants, like you'd be following a model that would be, changed to a certain protocol. So I'm working with the Public Health Agency on a different few projects, and they would actually make this like a standard procedure to go right.
Yeah.
So they currently say, right, if your CRP or inflammation is above a certain level, you can't leave A&E. So this, I assume this would become something down the line where you would say, okay, if your albumin levels are going like this, or the button or something, when they get the test back, I guess it's flagged in the system the way the normal ranges on a blood test would be flagged. That you would then say, okay, this
Just the
patient.
sheer practicality of
Yeah.
someone has to do that, someone has to kick it off, someone has to look at the results, and someone has to make a decision.
Well, that's what the consultants do for the other blood tests. So I guess this would be another one of the
This is
in
a
the
Do you
process.
think it's just going to be another?
Another thing for them to look at, because they make the decisions, right?
Oh,
So
yeah,
it's
I
a decision-making
accept
problem.
that.
So from what I understand, is that
Yeah,
right?
so
But
right,
this,
That's how you change any
this
protocols.
could be ideally a
And
cut, because of course they're getting blood tests out there.
every consultant or reg has to look oversee them to sign them off, and they make the decision of what to do. So whether they give an intervention or not.
Anyway,
And that's the thing that we're still trying to.
Your
sort out,
consultant,
that's the
your
thing.
consultant is obviously committed to this anyway,
Well, yeah.
and she would be prepared, yeah, okay.
So it literally is all just dependent. So all I'm doing at the moment is showing what's the potential that we can get out from these observations, and then we'll work with the clinician to see, actually that's useful, this bit's useful, that's
You see,
useful,
if
and then see
If I
what
remember
practical
your,
sense.
see, if I remember your numbers right, there's quite a number leave the ICU after 2 days or something, is that quite right? So in a way, you see,
But these patients are getting measurements
model.
every minute.
Hmm?
So I'm currently only looking at their blood measurements. I'm going to move that into the medical device data. So after an hour's data, like we'll have a lot of like good number of observations per patient.
Oh,
for that.
that's very good, you could have lots of observations, but are they
Well, this is the
useful
thing.
observations?
Yes, that's the issue. So
I
that's
mean,
where we're going to
it's like saying, having a continuous monitor. And so you think, this is fantastic, I've got 24 hours of data, but is it?
But that's the
Yeah,
chores to
that's-
see whether
Yeah.
what is within the intensive longitudinal data, the medical device data, what's useful. Because there is a lot being collected, but what can we do with it?
Will your program or whatever it's going to be fast enough that they put in some data and you press the button? How long does it take to get the result? Will it be
Well,
very
that's
quick?
it. If you're building a new model, then it'll take long. If you're feeding that patient
Into
into a model, then it will be
It'll be very
instant.
quick,
Yeah.
Yeah. So as long as on the ward you've got a computer.
But that's why we're working with computer scientists then to be able to set up this system.
Oh, yes.
So
Yeah.
likes of to have
They
a
could-
GUI
they
that
could network
a
it.
clinician could utilize. That's the type of thing. But yeah, we could have the models constantly fitting in the background of new data, but using the most up-to-date model to get real-time predictions going out. But yeah, it just depends on what we need.
And something I'm not sure whether, I didn't recognize the terms we're using, because obviously I'm way out of this. Consent of patients.
Yeah.
Now, do they consent to have that? You don't know?
I assume, yes. Well, I'm not involved in the data collection. I'm involved in the
You're using
data
that data.
analysis.
Oh, I don't know
I assume it's an agreement with
I don't
Queen's
know, it's
as
not a
an
defense.
employee.
I don't know, it's not a defense.
Well, I'll find out. But
But would it be,
I don't
you
believe that
Yes.
patient data can be used without consent.
You see, I mean,
There has to be an agreement with the trust. Actually, it's more the trust level of decision made, so that the.
There's an NHS ethical form
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
comes
yeah.
through.
you see, I mean,
It will go through the ethical approval.
I mean, I agree that they collect data. It's this business of using the data for research purposes. Have the patients given consent? Now, I assume that these patients are very ill when they go into ICU, and therefore the chances are they have not given consent.
I would imagine at
But-
that stage
but-
the consent
But
passes.
to be
through
fair,
the
my ideas of consent are 20 years old. And I don't know whether they've got more stringent or easier or not.
So why I've actually got around this in a different project is what I'm doing internally. So I'm actually part of the neurology review group internally. So I'm actually given a contract with the Belfast Trust.
Yeah,
So that gives me the indemnity. So I don't know if this would be passed over to the trust, so then they can run it, or you'll be given an honorary contract. There's lots of ways, but
Yeah.
that's how I would do it, because that's the way I've done it for any of the data that I see with neurology patients.
the PI of the research project,
Yeah.
we'll have that devolved on him.
Yeah,
So he's
okay.
on
Oh, so Charles will probably
Yeah,
need, yeah, I'd say Charles would need to be set up. And you give that through the illness broker's internal project method as well, because for research, basically you need to do like an illness broker's protocol guidance, but for internal projects, you basically become a member of the trust and you can actually get Microsoft Azure, so it's all trust protected by about 1 million security things. So I'm actually like a trust member for that project.
I
So
understand the
then,
concept.
so you can do the research, but then you can hand it over to the trust and actually devolve it that way, but that would take a bit of time, but I suppose it's all, has to start somewhere, I guess.
But just,
Yeah.
I always found this very difficult to do with consent,
Yeah.
because obviously there's huge amounts of data out there, and it's not so much it's because it's sitting there and it's really just asking for people to go and look at it. But you see, are they allowed to look at it? That seemed to be, a stumbling block that,
There's legislation in Northern Ireland that currently is blocking us using that. So there's talks at the minute currently in Stormont from the
I'm not sure what to say. For a long time, the legislation for everything to do with medical stuff over here lagged behind everywhere else. So it's, I mean, the mental health stuff was.
There's actually talks through the Belfast Regional City deal, and then they're actually talking in Stormont at the minute. So I know the folks working there. So they're actually trying to. Because this is a huge block, because there's researchers who could do really helpful things, but there's always these blocks, and you have to know someone in the public health agency, you have to know someone in the trust. But actually, that's why these internal projects are actually, there's a current ESRC.
No, I think this is probably out of line of what you're talking about today.
Your points are right, but they are current issues that I guess we're trying to work on.
Yeah, could you cast your minds back to a last speaker who noted that we contributed data to the National Joint Register in the UK, but our data cannot be analysed because they don't have the date of death. So we have been contributing our data from Northern Ireland, but it's not used. And this goes down to the idea that NISRA has about only allowing individuals to go and look up the details of an individual, whether they're alive or dead. That's GRO, General Registrar's Office in NISRA. So you can only do that one at a time, which is quite ridiculous, unless you have some special status barrier to get access to the support that they offer to some other studies. And the interesting thing is that death data is in the public domain. It's not their bloody data.
Yeah, it is. It's a frustration with the legislation, but also we have no executive either, so I'm not going to the political debate, but that's where it actually has to go. It's not within Queen's or the Trust, it actually is a legislation issue. So
they're operating under the wrong legislation. This is the problem.
You can start a picket, Gilbert,
No,
outside Stormont. I'll join you.
Very good. Very nice to do that.
I think that's us.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks very
Lisa
much.
again.